some of the channels. Let me quickly figure that out before we get started and reposition this maybe a little bit more to my needs. Okay. Let me quickly see. What's the issue? Reported here. Is Twitch down? No. Reported here. No, that works. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. So, what are we going to do today? So we basically, I have a lot of traffic on this repository that I set up more or less as a boilerplate of how to work with Node, a Node backend with Express using TypeScript. So this doesn't have any kind of documentation that goes beyond kind of like, okay, this is the setup itself, but how would you actually work with it is the question that we're going to ask us today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check it out, clone it right here in, where is it? Import, wait, how does this, I thought they have a direct, get from version control here. Get from version control, and we look at this, say Node Express TypeScript. Okay. Okay. Got you. Okay. So that is apparently a little bit of a problem, isn't it? Yeah, I thought so. Okay. So I'm going to create a new branch here that I'm going to call video just for us. Okay. And let's first kind of like see what kind of actions we want to do with this. So the README itself you cannot see, so let's ignore that, I guess, and go into a little bit of an exploration of what's going to happen here. So there is something called a Migrate JS, which is something you can run against your SQL. So this basically already contains a SQL ORM that you can use to easily maintain your models and so on. And authentication with JWT, so JSON Web Token authentication. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to create endpoints for that. So what you actually run, let's maybe look at that quickly, get a little bit familiarized of how that works, right? So I'm going to run my npm start, which you can see is basically, so the build will run yarn build dev, which basically will run the .env config and then basically runs the dist JS. And sorry, first it has to build, so it's going to run TypeScript, and basically when it's done compiling TypeScript, then it will run the def, right? So basically loading up the Express backend then as it's distributed. Now, the first thing we need to do in order to do that is we have to go to the env example and basically just copy that and call it .env. Okay, so I'm going to, yeah, that's going to be fine. I'm going to call this Twitch video. And then this should already basically the rest of it should be done. So if my SQL server is running and you have the right kind of files here, then there's no further step you need to do. So this even creates the database for you if possible. So what will it create though, right? So okay, it's going to create the database switch video, and in your source what you do have is a folder models and a user model with a migration JS, right? That would basically define an ID password and then stamps like created at, deleted at. So that's basically what we want to do. So let's see if that even happens, right? So let's have a quick look into our SQL, or actually, you can't see that over here. Okay, then let's do it differently. So here I'm simply going to say, okay, node Migrate Js. Oops, I should probably first install the modules. So I'm going to say yarn install. That's, of course, very necessary. Okay, so far so good. And so in the next iteration, I'm going to try it again and now say, okay, node migrate. Still get a problem. Let's see what this is. Access denied for user. Oops. There is, where did I copy the env in? Where is my .env? Oh, it placed it in tests for whatever stupid reason. Okay. Yeah, gotta be careful. Gotta be careful with that. All right. All right, and now it's done. Now that looks better. Sorry about that. Okay, so what we probably should do at this point is to kind of like figure out whether or not, you know, or basically what has happened to our database. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically say, hey, I want to have a new data source. In my case, that is MariaDB. User is root. Password I don't need, and that was Twitch. The video stream is off. Yeah, I have issues with Twitch. Hold on. So, but is it, do you see it though? Do you hear me? Let's see. Let's see what's happening here. What's going on today? Okay. Just timer in chat. Okay, let's double check here. Okay. Right. So a lot of reporting here on what's happening. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, I have noticed that Twitch, I don't know what's wrong with it today. Yeah, that is weird. Okay, so YouTube seems to work according to... Yeah, I wonder if I should just restart the stream and see what happens, huh? Yeah, guess you have to go to YouTube for now. Guess that's what it is. Let's try it out. Let's actually take care of this problem because there's no use in... Wait, let me go to standby quickly. Where's the typo? Where's the typo? All right. So, hope this works. Oh, that is indeed right. Right. Let me actually double check that. That is a very interesting point. Oh, I can't visit that right now, can I? I can. Not. Okay. Let's first fix this. So we called this Twitch video. And let me go back to the regular settings here. Okay. Let's go over here. And let's have a glance. So yeah. So basically here, we now, oops, the wrong thing here. Where am I? Schema. Here basically now I created my Twitch video database, my user with ID, username, password, created that, deleted that, and so on. So just like the migration was defined. Now, but this is of course just a little bit of a starting point. So the real interesting question is, okay, so how do I define models and how do I work with them? Right? And this is basically the biggest difference between, you know, how you would work with JavaScript compared to how you would work with TypeScript. But let's first kind of finish the walkthrough. So we're going to let this run for now. So we have kind of that taken care of, right? This should restart in a second. There we go. Yeah, by the way, if you see an error here occurring, so that is sometimes because so NodeMon tries to start prior to the build being done. And that'll clear itself out because the file watcher will kick in, and so don't worry about that. But you do have a new folder now, or should have at least. My indexer doesn't pick up on yet, but we'll see that in a second. And let's go back here and basically start exploring how this works. So as you probably see down here, there is a list of registered routes, right? So what happens is that basically the routes that exist are auto registered. So by their pure existence, we basically are hooking them into the regular application. So let's first have a look at the auth.ts. And by the way, up here you now see the dist. So where it ultimately compiles to. So the way this looks like is basically you have your different routes. So let's just start with the endpoint API auth, right? Where we have a case for a post method, a get method, and a put method. And we're basically going to attach our functionality directly in there. So you of course know that from Express, right? So how you would basically handle those things. The only difference here is from a typed perspective. That's something that you want to make sure of. So whenever you're dealing with something like request, response, you know, and Express itself, in order for TypeScript in strict mode to actually allow you to work with particular you know, functionality or properties, be sure to use this from Express serve static core instead of Express. And that's basically ultimately you know, access to the TypeScript definitions prior to the compilation of how you would normally use Express. Now, that said, let's basically walk through this line by line to understand what is happening, right? So ultimately, this post here is what we're going to look at first, and the intention, of course, is, as you might guess, to generate a user, right? To get a new user, and that's basically what we're going to see how that actually works and why we don't see any kind of logic here. So the first thing that we're going to do is basically we load auth from middleware auth. Let's have a look at that quickly. Right, so this is our middleware. Right, so and you basically you can see how I declared this here personally, right? The basically like how what a request can accept and so on. The auth itself, right? Let's see where this is basically used. I'm wondering if we should go in there later. Maybe we should. Yeah, no. Let's look at this quickly. So just like a regular Express middleware, what we're doing is we're basically dealing with incoming requests and want to make decisions on are we going to let that request through based on the JSON web token that we have, and also based on whether or not the route itself is protected, right? So we have a couple of very simple methods here. We have assign that basically writes the JSON web token and returns it. We have decode, so that would basically get from JSON web token, which I pass in here as a string, and try to decode it. Protected is then the actual middleware, so to speak. As you can see, this ultimately has then the next function that I can attach to particular routes in order to make decisions on whether or not I want a user to, well, be authenticated and or if that's not a requirement. And that's basically it for auth. The interesting difference here in working with regular JavaScript is, of course, that I can type what kind of result I have, right? So here you basically see auth object. Now, if you work with TypeScript a lot, then this will be super clear to you. If you come from a typed background like Java, this will also be super clear to you. If you do work with a language like PHP and work typed, then this will also be clear to you. But for everybody else, let's quickly see what we're basically doing here. So, of course, there is no such thing as simply an object, right? So I can, of course, if I want to see what, if I say here in this case, right, a JWT, that's a string, right? That's a simple object. Sorry, that's a simple type. But whenever I want to define how an object looks like, or if I want to define how what an array can hold, what type of objects it can hold, then I basically need to define an interface in TypeScript. So in this case, I want to ensure at time of compilation that what is returned here is an auth object, so that across the board, whenever I get a response from this middleware, I will have a user ID and an array that is not closely defined, as you can see, but could have been. And that is a necessity for basically this return object. Otherwise, I cannot, when I use this somewhere else, right? So when we see how auth is used then later, it will make a lot of sense, because all of a sudden you will notice that it prevents any kind of typing issues along the road. So there's a little bit of a detour I should probably make here, because this, I cannot emphasize this enough. This is, so whenever something like TypeScript gets introduced, there's a lot of question of like, why, and do we really need it, and is that something that I should use even though I don't work in a team? And in a very primitive form, let's just whip up some kind of scratch here. Yep. Let's make a very simple example here in a basic manner. Okay, so let's just imagine you have a JavaScript function that basically says return with exclamation. Okay. and this does nothing else but return with the exclamation. Now, if I basically somewhere else in my code, so right, imagine that you get some kind of complexity here, and then eventually you do something like return with the exclamation, hello world, right? And the output of that would, of course, basically be hello world with the exclamation mark, right? Pretty straightforward. However, if you basically said, well, what if I have a function that could potentially make a huge difference of whether or not the type is correct? So, and probably a better example here, function add to input, and I say return input plus 2. So in this example, right, if I said 12, that's probably the intended way of doing it, of using this function, then the output, of course, would be 14. However, if somebody basically passes in something like this, right, it's basically a side effect of, you know, running through a couple of iterations of code and passing up higher level functions and so on, then all of a sudden, this will be my result. And if I basically then say, okay, and that result again is used to, you know, like to be passed on yet in another chain of code, then those kind of things can actually cause a lot of really bad bugs without without you having an easy ability to find what exactly the culprit was, right? Also with because your tests are probably defined in a way where you wouldn't even notice this, because you probably wouldn't write type safe tests. And that's basically why TypeScript is such a success story at the moment. And there are a couple of other reasons that speak for TypeScript, but this is, if you ask me, the most important factor, that you actually have a way to work with JavaScript, which is an interpreted string language, in a type-safe way, right? Something it is not really made for, at least initially. Okay, so that's why this auth object is very important, and you can define that, of course, however you want. But let's jump back to where we've been, right? So the next thing that we basically encounter is the resolver. Now, the resolver is basically something that abstracts our business logic if we don't need any kind of special treatment. So as you can see, our user resolver is, for example, obviously something that does need special treatment. So I'm not just using the resolver here. There's a user resolver, and basically I create a new user resolver with the user model. Right, so before we look into that, let's maybe look into the user model and see how that basically looks like. So here I have a particular function, create, and I have also a function login. Now, as you can see, there's no update, there's no delete. There are a couple of things that are simply missing. Now, the reason for that is the basically the parent of every model that basically abstracts away anything that would have that you would normally need, right? So a get for if you want to retrieve an entity by a particular ID, a find if you're looking for something based on a particular condition, then you have a create, you have an update, and so on. So if I already have a create, why does the user model require its own create function, you might ask? And well, the reason for that is because a user create needs to do a little bit more than just inserting data, right? So we have this a couple of special requirements. So as you can, for example, see here, we're not just taking the user's password and writing it to our database. We're actually going to hash this password with bcrypt. And by the way, this if you so this is kind of like an auto-generate salt. If you plan to use this in production, be sure to read about security requirements. This is fine, I would say, but certainly not the best you can do when it comes to hashing. Now, that said, in that case, we're basically generating our ID manually, hashing the password, and then using the regular insert mechanism to basically insert and then also retrieve the user. And if our model were simple, then of course that wouldn't be necessary, and we would simply rely on the parents create, right? And by the way, here you can, this is maybe also interesting. So when you start to initialize a model, you can basically also define what shall be hidden if you retrieve it, right? In that case, the password, for example. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Then here I define a registration interface, same idea, right? I'm not going to reiterate about stuff like that. But that's the reason why those kind of things are defined and all over the place. Okay, so now that we understand what our user model is, let's wonder what our resolver is. Now, our resolver is basically something that creates a layer between a request. So this is a pure API. So between a request and a model. So as you can see in the constructor, we are expecting a model to be placed in. And then those are basically the functions that you can possibly directly do here in the resolver. As you can see, there's no delete, by the way, because we only set delete stamps, so everything is going to be a soft delete. But of course, you can add that per your requirement. So basically, what in our case, the get is something that we can see here, right? So if you want to retrieve a user, what's basically happening is to say, okay, so auth protected. You remember this is the middleware that ensures that you need to be logged in. And then basically we have the user resolver get. And as you probably noticed, thinking back of the get of the resolver, so I can't set an ID, but if not, right, then my own ID is basically used, right? So from a security standpoint, this assumes that every logged in user, or and every registered user can retrieve information about other users, right? So this is something that depending on what kind of application you're building, might be something you want to revisit. But that's basically the current setup, right? There's a simple protected and not a protected self. And then the update is kind of like self-explanatory. Here we update the user entity. Okay, let's kind of like give this a little bit of a shot and create a user so we see how that works, right? So let's use Postman. It's Postman for that. And right, this is something I need to do in Chrome. This is something I need to do in Chrome because my Brave is too restrictive. Okay. Now, let me see if I can do this. So I think you don't see that yet, so give me a second to do some settings here in OBS to make that work. Uh, um, okay, let's see. Let's see. Is it this one? Yep, that's it. Okay, so you should basically see this right now. All right. Okay. So far, so good. Can I somehow make this smaller? I'll get rid of this maybe somehow. No. Okay. Why not? Well, let's live with it. So endpoint would be API auth, right? Let's do this. So since I use the interface, right, the only thing I need to basically, this will just automatically fail if my my body doesn't look correctly, right? This makes it very easy to get some kind of security here. So, and I unfortunately have to do it like this for now. I don't know exactly how you will see this, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try and kind of monitor on the side whether or not this is enough space for you. So I need a username, right? Let's call this tester. And I need a password. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's send that over. And we're sending this apparently at the wrong location here. API auth. Yeah, that's important. Okay. So what you see now is basically that we have retrieved or generated a new user. I have not received a token, so this is also something you might reconsider. But what we basically have to do now is to say, okay, so we do have this ID username and that exists now, and I can use the same kind of logic now to basically authenticate against it, and that would be in my API login. And as you can see, I've now received my JSON Web Token that I can use to make any kind of authenticated calls, right? So just here on the left again. So this is the endpoint we hit now. And you can see in this case, we did it a little bit more manual. So we basically tried whether or not we can log in the user and then decided whether or not we're going to create a JSON Web Token or return an unauthenticated, unauthorized, sorry, code. So far, so good. So we have that now. Now let's see what kind of other endpoints we can basically do now. So we could get our get, right? We could make a get call against auth if we had that token in our header, right? So I'm gonna, for now, just copy this over and here go to, I have to maximize this again here, into the authorization and say it's a bearer token. Put this in here for now. So I'm kind of like trying to monitor whether you see that, but it's a little bit outside of your screen, but it's fine. So I set this authorization header, and now basically if I go to get and go to auth, it should be able to here successfully retrieve my user, right? And you can actually see here also like what was retrieved. You can here see on the left in the terminal is also visible, which I kind of wonder why, but let's not worry about that. There's a console log in there somewhere. Okay, so far so good. And so let's look at what other routes we have, and let's kind of wonder where our controllers would go in this scenario, right? So what you probably noticed is that there doesn't seem to be a lot of business logic. And if so, we're directly writing them in the routes. And that's perfectly fine, for the simple reason that this will actually not really occur that much in such a setup, right? So there will only be basically data transformation, not so much conditional logic that you write. So here, feel free to have a look at the example TS file here, also in your routes. So what this will do is it will show you that not always there's a necessity for to write a model, right? So you remember from users, right, that user has an index TS and a migration JS. In that case, also user interface. But a migration JS is actually all you need. And please refer to how you're supposed to generate those, and how migrations work if you make changes to the database from the repo we looked at before, or it's probably listed down in whatever platform you currently works. And but more importantly here, so I can create those models on the fly. Do you see how I'm directly loading model here? So not user model or not anything else that actually exists. And I basically create test directly from new model, right? Which is normally something that I only extend, and then directly pass that into the resolver. So if I had a migration for test, which I don't have if I remember, nope. But if I had a migration for test and would have migrated that, so in other terms, if the database table or tables would exist, then this is all I need in order to actually generate this model. So the necessity for a class that would actually be such a model is only required if you really do something that goes outside of the realm of a regular resolver. So, walking through the examples here once more. So you have, an API public that's, like a little bit of a test point that you can basically play around with. It's not really interesting. Then same thing here. So we already know this now, that the auth protected is something that you can basically use. And this is basically what's running fake now. And this is interesting then now for our next topic. But at this very moment, so what is actually going to happen when I would run this? And actually might as well just try it out, right? So let's go to get here and change this to API fake, and then it receives an ID. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This would actually fail, right? This would return null. Now, the reason why this even exists is just for mocking purposes, right? Just for testing. This is basically supposed to introduce you to the last topic of this repo. So basically, we already talked about why MySQL, how that is integrated, how authentication with JSON Web Token works. And now basically, let's look at what kind of testing we have. So let me actually close all those. Yep, and even that. And let's look at, so we have 3 test files here, right, already. So one is our endpoints test. So what we're using here is super test. That's a pretty common testing environment. It basically allows you to create requests against something as if that were an actual server endpoint. So the way you write it is actually the nicest thing about it. And let's just skip over the before and so on. So here, is actually a little bit of a necessity of like reading the routes and like creating, actually destroying the server, to be honest with you, and then restarting it. But here you can see how it works. So here's my fake request, and then I simply say .get, and can basically then in a very easy manner just say, okay, what kind of endpoint am I trying to reach, right? So this is basically the alternative to using something like Postman. In that case, I'm not doing something too crazy here. I expect the status code response to be 200, so a success, right? Or also called OK sometimes. And I expect that the body, so obviously this expects a JSON in that case, dot test has the value sum, right? So just for reference, if you go into our example route, and you can actually see that. So API public, this is what I have. And ultimately, I'm returning a JSON with the property test and the key or the value sum. And that's exactly what I expect to happen here. Then same thing with API protected. So here, basically, I expect that a 401 is being thrown. And basically, I walk through all of the different variations of what could possibly happen, right? So one of the things that you probably noticed is that the test reporting, or let's actually go to that later. Let's ignore that for now. In the other tests, the internal tests is something that probably you never have to touch. This is more or less just something like, okay, how do the utilities and middleware work? If you are well, extending functionality, or then like you might have to touch this, of course. And then the models, last but not least, is basically how I test whether or not the transactions against the model entities would work. And the only interesting thing here is maybe the add expected outcome. So what the connection does is if there is no MySQL connection, which in a test scenario there never is, right? We're ignoring setting up the SQL connection. Then it automatically returns a mock version of the SQL transaction, right? So that the actual transaction is then shot against the well, basically the fake transaction layer, rather than against the actual database itself. And that's pretty useful. So you can avoid that if you want to test locally, but for any kind of continuous integration, that makes a lot of sense, right? And let's quickly now run this and see what we can derive from that, right? So in your where are we? So we're running that with Jest, of course, at the end of the day. Right, as you can see, there is a Jest setup files, run and band, and then coverage. That's already set up for continuous integration. So let's do this and say, okay, let's run yarn test. And basically, that's not going to be super exciting because we haven't touched anything. But what we expect is basically then whenever this is done, then we get our test report right here and basically can see what uncovered lines we have, and how this basically, well, a regular test reporting, right? I mean, you know this, and this is also placed here in coverage again if you want to look at it visually. But of course, more importantly, the reason to do that is a different one. So when you set up, let me close that. It's just going to be annoying. When you set up your, well, I'm using Travis here in this case, right? In combination with code climate, then you can basically come to the conclusion that, okay, so if you make any kind of pull requests and then set up your GitHub actions accordingly, you can basically allow that only merged, or only tests that actually worked can be merged into master, and from there any kind of automatic deployment can directly take over and can set your hooks accordingly. That's basically the how to use of this. The last thing that you probably want to have a look at is a little bit under the hood. So if you go to like the actual MySQL layer, this is a very primitive wrapper around MySQL 2 promise. So the only thing that's doing is basically, and we can see that here in, by the way, this is basically how the mocking setup works, but more interesting, of course, down here, where you have a couple of functions like raw, query, get, insert, find, update, and so on, that will kind of help you to generate SQL so you probably rarely want to use raw because if you make simple requests, then basically just tables and then an object of values will probably do, for example, for an insert, if you don't have to do something crazy. So that's probably something that you ultimately want to do. All of the so what you do with the actual connection here is of course in your responsibility, but all of the provided functions themselves translate into executed prepared statements. So from a security standpoint, you should not be too concerned as long as the keys that you use are not coming from the user, right? So that the actual conditions themselves can be, of course, defined by user, but as long as they're only values and not keys, which would ultimately create the potential to make selections that you don't want to allow, or even endanger the integrity of your database. Yeah, so far so good. Okay, then I'm gonna jump into a meeting now at 5. Since I have 5 minutes left, I was kind of wondering, or no, you know what? I'm gonna do this privately, Marco, and give you a call in a second. For everybody else, thanks for stopping by, and I see you when I see you.